quite surprised, or not surprised, because, well, glad a lot of you showed up. Security is obviously a hot topic, and normally 2-3 years ago I would have to explain to an audience why. I guess I can skip that stage. Everybody knows why security is important. I'm a security officer here at Schuberg, Philis, and I'm really excited about security. I love security. I love my job. I think I have the most interesting job in the world. Well,
second.
That's what I was about to say, because how do you argue with a guy who's the security officer for a company that handles 30+% of the business web traffic? He must have a more interesting job than I have, and that's not something I admit often. So when they asked me, like, who would you like to speak to tweakers about security, it's my number one. I made a list. Number 1 was Andy, number 2 was Andy, and number 3 was Andy.
I'm only coming once.
Yeah, that's what you think. Because, well, he's somebody that's broadly recognized as an authority on the area of security, on the topic of security. He's also a good speaker. He's also a fun person to be with. I have fond memories of him trying to explain the game of football, or at least what they call football, the game where you have an egg and you throw it. And trying to explain to me that it's an iterative game of prisoner's dilemma, which I hope shows up in his slides later. We promised to talk about cloud security, and then, yeah, Andy being Andy, he sort of said, but I really want to give this one. And we think it's appropriate because it's less technical. I know you've all been grilled by the other Andy about Kubernetes today. You're really into the technical one, and this one is more on the human side of security. Because as Toon was very well demonstrating that all security issues are in the end, most often, human issues, and as Paul demonstrated, it's humans who make the difference, whether or not something really turns into a security issue or just a happy ending. So with that, I would like to give the word to Andy. If this doesn't touch any questions you had, later on we'll be taking questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I really do appreciate that. I recognize that you're taking times out of your busy lives to come here and advance yourselves, and hopefully I can help with that. So when we think about security, we often think of it in the context of risk management. And so we have some common beliefs. How are humans at risk management? If you had to judge them, what would you say? Right? Universally, you'd use words sort of like this. But let me tell you something, you're all wrong. Humans are fantastic at risk management. I present to you as evidence the fact that we are the ones in this room and not velociraptors. Although having just watched Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom on my way over, I don't want to have to get into a bet with a velociraptor over which one of us is better, but they're not here anymore. But we feel like humans aren't good at risk management. So it's important to understand how humans operate, and some of this is about how our brains work. Some of it is about how we are cultured and the things that we're going to do. And so let's first start with a story about a hydra. Now, a hydra is a form of a jellyfish, and it's really useful to look at other life forms and how they operate, because we can see where we diverged from them evolutionarily. And hundreds of millions of years ago, we split off from where the hydra ends up. And the hydra has this really neat thing, which is the hydra's body is covered in sensors. Right? It can feel anything that touches it. But you know what the hydra is missing? Any notion of where those sensors are. So you come over and you touch a hydra, and this sensor, it's like, oh, I've been touched. And the hydra doesn't know if it's that one or that one over there. And when you think about this, imagine if you were burned and you didn't know if it was your right hand or your left hand. What are you going to do? Well, that's the problem. The jellyfish, or the hydra, only has one thing it can do. It blorps. And hopefully that gets it out of danger. It might kill it instead. It could blorp right into the mouth of whatever it was that just touched it. But knowing where it was touched is not helpful to the hydra. So it's never evolved an attention or sensory apparatus to figure out where it was touched. Humans are a little bit different most of the time, But often when presented with a new risk, a thing that we have no frame of reference and no model for, what do? We panic, we blorp, we do anything because anything has to be better than nothing, right? Those are the places where we're bad at risk management, because quite often nothing is actually better than something. So let's think about how humans model risk, or model decision making. And so for this, I'm using the OODA loop, coined by Colonel Boyd of the United States Air Force. It's the observe, orient, decide, act. Right? And he originally used this for war fighting. He said, look, when you're in a plane and you see the other person, you observe them, you have to orient. You have to figure out who can be behind the other one. If you can get behind them, that's great. Decide to slide behind them and shoot them. If they can get behind you first, you have a problem, get away. And so he built this model for just thinking tactically about decision making, but it turns out it's a really useful model in general to think about what's going on whenever we interact with the world. And so within observation, you might think of this as your attention, right? Your ability to look at a thing and see what's happening. For orientation, that's really going to be about the processing power of how you look at the world, take this new input, decide what you're going to do. Then, of course, you have to have executive function, make a decision. Anybody in here a parent of a small child? Yeah, executive function is all about parenting. That's what you're trying to do, is get your children to figure out how to decide to do a thing and then actually go do it, which is why we practice training our responses so we can actually act in a repeatable fashion. After you have eaten, you should decide to brush your teeth, and you need to know how to actually brush your teeth. That's currently my challenge with my children. They will go brush their teeth, which doesn't appear to involve water or toothpaste or a toothbrush. So we ask ourselves this question, and in the security world, it's all the time, right? All of you have just been practicing managing systems, and at some point, you're going to run across a security professional who's going to say, why did you make that bad decision? Or you're the security professional, and you're going to be the one saying, why did you make that bad decision? And let me decode that for you. Do you know what the word bad really means? It's a social fiction. It's really stupid, but we're too polite to say stupid. So we say, why do people make bad decisions? But our quote is, what we're really thinking is, why were you so stupid as to make that decision? Now, nobody feels good about that, so we say bad. But the problem is it's not a stupid decision. Does anybody in here think that they're stupid? Great, I'm really glad. Oh, wait, I saw one hand half go up over there. And then he realized that was probably a stupid decision, put it back down. But how many of you have ever had somebody call one of your decisions stupid or bad as the polite way of saying stupid? All the time, right? What's really happening here is that the decision is incomprehensible to us. That in the place where we're standing, we do not understand the decision that you just made. So we think it's stupid, but we're polite and we call it bad. We don't recognize that the failure is our own. It's the failure to understand what was going on in that other person's head. And oftentimes we see this. Somebody in the business wants to do a thing, and so they come over to the security person and they say, hey, I would like to do this thing. Has anybody ever had to interact with a security team doing that? Was that a fun experience? No. When you walked in the door, what did you think about that security professional? You thought that they just really wanted to do harm to your baby. Whatever this was, right, they're the villain, right? So you walk in and you're thinking, oh my God, all I have to do is survive this. But they're really going to do whatever they can to make me feel bad, to make me feel stupid, to tell me all the bad things I'm doing. Meanwhile, on the other side, the security person's sitting there waiting for you to walk in. You walk in and they're like, oh my God, here's another person doing a stupid thing, going to put the company out of business, and they have no idea the harm they're making just because they want to get their bonus for Christmas, right? Now, what's fascinating is you should take the security professional and wait until they try to build anything for themselves and see them make all the same choices you made that they called stupid when you made them. This is like the cardinal sin of all security professionals. We cut the same corners you cut, but only when it's for ourselves because we're so smart about it. But it's modal bias. This is Amsterdam, which is always an entertaining place for me to talk about cycling. Because cycling and walking are interesting things. How many of you cycle, ride a bicycle? Excellent. How many of you walk places? Awesome. When you are biking, what do you think about pedestrians? Right? They're walking on the bike path. Why can't they get over on that very inconvenient pedestrian walkway? They're oblivious to what you're doing. And the last thing you want to do is run into them, because it's not like you have a helmet on or brakes or anything. Like, your bikes are crazy here compared to the US ones, but you also at least aren't going at the same speed we travel at. Now, when you're a pedestrian, what do you think about those cyclists? Right? You think that they're crazy and dangerous and trying to run you over. I went for a jog the first time I was in Amsterdam. I had no idea that this very nice pathway along the canal was not for me. Man, were those cyclists rude when they were trying to run me off their road. But what's fascinating is you switch between those modes. How many of you have been cycling, been angry at a pedestrian for something they did, then parked your bicycle, got off it, and did the exact same thing that pedestrian did, and thought that the bicyclist was crazy for yelling at you? This is human nature. We preference the mode that we are in. We have a very hard time thinking outside of that mode into somebody else's mode. And so breaking through that is critical for thinking about how to make better choices and how to understand choices. And so this is the power of models. When we think about orienting to the world, understanding someone's decision that is heavily influenced by the models that we have just built in and are ingrained. And as I just pointed out, you can flip between models very quickly, but you don't even think about it. So you have a set of models from when I'm a pedestrian, and when I'm a driver, and when I'm in the office, and when I'm at home. Right? How many of you have practices on the internet at home that you wouldn't do in the office, and that you would make fun of fellow colleagues if you caught them doing, like reusing passwords? Right? So these models are really important for us to think about what's going on, and it's all about the context and framing and expectations that we bring into a situation. And what's fascinating about these models is how often they don't match up to the real world. So there was some research done in the 1960s. Now, first thing, every time someone says there's some research done in the 1960s, take it with a grain of salt. Researchers in the 1960s in the social sciences were reckless and dangerous. They did things that we would never accept today, and they barely wrote their results down. So this is one of those, so you can decide if it's apocryphal or not. The researcher who did it disavows it, mostly because they'd be brought up on charges now if they tried it. They took 5 monkeys and they put them in a room with a table. On the table, they put a novel object. Now, monkeys are much like humans. If you saw a novel object in a room with 5 of you, what would you do? Yeah, they sprayed them with a fire hose to teach them not to pick up the object. And they would do this, put in an object until the monkeys would go cower in a corner because they were afraid of the hose. You know, it's sort of the opposite of the Pavlovian research. But then they did a fascinating thing. They took one of the monkeys out of the room, brought in a fresh monkey, put the novel object on the table. What do you think happens? 4 monkeys attack one. The 4 monkeys know what that monkey wants to do, and they go beat it up. They teach it that the novel object is dangerous. Not that the researchers are mean people. And then they keep doing this until you have no monkey who is in the room who has ever been sprayed with a fire hose. And yet, they will continue to enforce the rule because they have this historical paranoia in their framing. Much like passwords, how many people work in a company that causes you to rotate your passwords every 90 or 120 days? Yep. Do you know why? Anybody know why 90 to 120 days? Because when they wrote the Orange Book, that was how long it took to break a password. So, a 25-year-old technology standard governs our practices today. Either your password is not safe at all because there's an online oracle I can use to attack it, or you reused it, or it's basically safe forever because there's no good way for someone to attack it. The best answer for this is to get rid of passwords, because while I am convinced that password rotation is silly, auditors are totally not convinced by this argument. So we just move past passwords. Then we also think about other research. This is my favorite one, the prisoner's dilemma. For those of you not familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, it's an economic game in which we take 2 people who have committed a crime and we throw them in jail. We caught them doing the crime, but not quite. Let's say they robbed a bank, but they did it in a stolen car, but they hid the money. We don't have the evidence that they robbed the bank. That's like a big crime, stealing a car, who really cares? So we offer each of them a choice. And we say to Alice and Bob, we say, look, you could cooperate. And in this case, cooperate isn't really cooperating, it's cooperating with your buddy, right? Say nothing, or you could cheat on them. Cooperate with us, law enforcement. And this is like the basis of almost every police show, is at some point you get 2 people, you put them in separate rooms, and you tell them each you're gonna give them a good deal. And here's what the deal looks like. We say, look, if you cooperate with us, and or cooperate with your partner, and so does your partner, we send you to jail for grand theft auto, 3 years in prison. But if they cheat and they rat you out, you're going to jail for 10 years. Now, flip side, if they stay silent and you confess, you only go to jail for 1 year because you're such a great model citizen who's learned blah, 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 blah. But we have to admit that if both of you happen to cheat, you're going to jail for 5 years. And in fact, we've offered them the same deal. Now, when you test this on grad students, which is generally the available test population for almost all social science research, which is a really bad population because I cannot think of a group that least embodies human variety than graduate students in Western educational institutions. What we find is that they will only cooperate 13% of the time. Like, that's as little trustworthy as they are. However, we can get both of them to cheat 40% of the time. What does this tell you about human nature? Trust no one, which I love from a security architecture standpoint, but from getting along in civil society, this seems really problematic. But this informs so much of our decision making that it is ingrained in choices that we make because we don't think our partners are as trustworthy as we are. And so we're going to tend to move first to screw them before they can screw us. Right? Now, it turns out that maybe we should study other populations than just grad students in Western universities. And so the Australians were the first ones to figure this out. One of the universities there, they said, hey, we have this prisoner's dilemma we're testing. There's a prison right over there. So in fact, they went and they did the same simulation in the prison. Now, the way that you do this simulation with grad students or prisoners is not getting them to commit crimes. You do it with a positive reinforcement, which also screws with all of the outputs. Where it's like, okay, you get a candy bar or 2 candy bars, or smokes or 2 packs of cigarettes. But what they discovered is when they went to prisoners, cooperation jumps to 30% of the time. Both of them are cooperating. That is astounding. Like a 2 percentage point shift would have been amazing. 17%, more than doubling. And the cheating drops to 19%. This is amazing. This is like mind-blowing from our whole model of humans. Humans are fundamentally trustworthy. Yet just a minute ago, we were like, no, humans, can't trust them. Don't trust anybody. Right? But what's going on here? First of all, we should recognize that they might not see this as the same game that we do. Right? We write this up as this nice 2-player game. Really, there's a third player in the game. There's the person who's giving out the candy or smokes or money, and you want to maximize how much money you're getting out of them into your community. That's generally a good thing. They're also a community that might have different expectations. Grad students probably are a little bit more cutthroat with each other than prisoners are. Prisoners have to live with each other for a really long time in really tight spaces. Grad students get away from their peers at it pretty quickly. So they might recognize that prisoners' dilemma games are always iterated, even when the researcher tells you that they're not. So they're playing a different game. But it is fundamental to recognize that humans are not this monolithic, untrustworthy thing, and that should affect our model and how we think about them. But we should recognize that we have confirmation bubbles, right? And what that really means is if I tell you that humans are not trustworthy, they're fundamentally untrustworthy, and told you, go read the news for a day, right? You will find evidence scattered throughout there about how untrustworthy humans are. If I tell you that humans are trustworthy, and you go read the same articles, you will walk away with all of the evidence about how trustworthy humans are. Right? We confirm the beliefs that we have and operate on them, and we discard the ones that don't match that. And when there's really something jarring, we will often rationalize it and say, well, in hindsight, that was what I expected. Because how many of us actually sit down with the news and say, I believe humans are trustworthy, I'm going to look for evidence. No, if you happen to find an overwhelming amount of evidence, you'll be like, oh yeah, humans are trustworthy, but only in Amsterdam. Don't trust those French. Sorry if anybody here is French, but okay, maybe not really sorry. So let's talk about decision making. Poor decision on my part right there, potentially. So decision making is all about risk choices, tactical risk choices. You want to do a thing, you're paying a cost in risk. to get some benefit in positive outcomes. And so what plays into that are those costs and fears and what you expect is your outcome. Now, sometimes that risk is easy to understand. Now, for those of you who are not American, you might not recognize this car immediately. This is the Ford Pinto. Now, the Ford Pinto gained notoriety because it was one of the easiest to understand automotive safety failures in the history of automobiles. Ford decided that the way to improve traction in this car was to add weight over the rear axle. Easiest weight to move around in a car is the gas tank. So they put the gas tank right in front of that rear bumper. So if you rear end it, you crack the gas tank and you have petrol all over your accident scene, which doesn't generally mean everything explodes all the time, although that's what everybody remembers. So we've told ourselves is the story. The real issue is whenever you get into an accident, your car is immediately undrivable. Right? Whereas if there's nothing there, you get into an accident, you have a dented fender, you're very upset, you have to go to the body shop, but you can drive your car for a week until you need to do so. If you're not an automotive engineer, you immediately understand that problem. The moment I said gas tank in front of the rear bumper, everybody's like, right, I have a model of how a car works. This seems like a really bad plan. Let's jump forward to the Jeep Cherokee. People remember this one. This is the vehicle that Wired did the stunt hacking on of a Jeep Cherokee at 70 miles an hour, taken over the internet. How many people here think they could provide a simple summary that non-computer science engineers could trivially understand about the bad design choices made by Jeep? Because I can't. A few people raise their hands, right? We can walk through and talk about the CAN bus and connecting the entertainment system to that, and the infotainment system had an uplink back because they're doing telematics. But none of those choices on their own is implicitly bad. It's the combination of choices that becomes a problem. And it's the complexity of this system and how hard it becomes for people making individual point choices to see the costs that they're incurring, right? Where we have these complex systems. Think about it as if you have a firewall in front of an application, right? And now it's easy if you're the application developer to say, oh, hey, the firewall is going to protect me from a lot of stuff. I don't have to do good security. And you're the network engineer who controls the firewall. And you're like, yeah, it's okay if I don't maintain this all the way, because that application, of course, has good security. And you end up with worse security out of the end of it because neither person has the correct motivating fears when they're making decisions. Now, context also matters. This is the audience participation. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you all to raise your hands, and then I'm going to put up a series of questions. And when the answer becomes no, put your hand down. I have this in US dollars. Feel free to mentally convert it to euros because its order of magnitude is all that matters. So I'm going to let you play a game, and in this game, you're going to bet once. This is not an iterated game. You only get to play once. You're going to bet once an amount of money, and I'm going to roll a 20-sided die. Your expected outcome is to gain 5%, which is if your number comes up, you get 20 times your initial bet plus your initial bet back. If it doesn't come up, I get your initial bet, right? Very simple game of chance. Now, I'm going to ask you if you would play this game at a certain betting amount. So you're all going to put up your hands because your starting answer is yes, I would play at $0. Great, good. Now, do you play at $1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000? We've got a couple. 100,000? A million? The last time I gave this talk, I had somebody with their hand still up at $1 million. I was doing it at the Army War College, and it was somebody who spends billions because they're a weapons systems buyer. She's like, yeah, I will totally take that bet. I was like, you and me should talk. And he's like, well, do you have the 21 million to pay me if I win? I was like, well, maybe not. Now, what's fascinating here, though, is from an economic game perspective. This is the same bet. Your answer should be the same the whole time, except it's not. Because it's what you give up to get it. You look at this and you say, look, I'm reasonably well off. I'm willing to bet, a meal ticket. Most people went down, around 10, 100, 1,000, right? Maybe I'll bet a meal, maybe I'll bet 2 meals on something really good. But I'm not going to bet everything here. In the US, do you have lotteries here? Yes, okay, great. I always want to make sure I'm in the right thing. So lotteries. In the US, we often call them that they're like a tax on the mathematically incompetent. Right? People say that here. Here's the deal. If you live below the poverty line, you generally have no path past the poverty line. Getting up past it is really hard, especially anywhere that there's a good social safety net. Why? Because social safety nets all have cliff out points at some point where we say, oh, look, you're making enough money that you don't need all these benefits. And unfortunately, we put in the same cliff point in all of the benefits, and the value we take away is more than the marginal that you just made. We make it really hard to get out of poverty. And so if you're just below that line and you have an extra couple bucks, you spend them on a lottery. Sure, you're likely throwing the money away. You at least get some entertainment value, but if you win, it's enough to jump you up into the middle class, or hopefully all the way into the upper class. So that's why people will play the lottery, because for them, the value of a marginal dollar is actually smaller than the value of a marginal dollar was to you. In the same way that for some of you, the value of the marginal $1,000 was a risk you'd take for $20,000, but for others it wasn't. So very important for us to understand these contexts matter, that the cost we see may be more harmful to the other party or less harmful, and they're willing to make choices we wouldn't. And now we come to the Peltzman effect, because we've all been talking about cost, and cost is mostly risk. What do we think is going to happen? And so we go along, and in our life, we're often presented with risks, right? When you walk out of this building, is there a chance you're going to be run over by a car? Yeah, especially in these parking lots. It's very strange with people parked on sidewalks and things, right? But you just sort of accept that. That's like if you didn't take any risk, you'd never leave your house and you'd die, which seems kind of risky. So you take risks to get stuff done. And so you have this amount of perceived risk, that's your vertical axis, and you take steps to reduce it. Maybe you don't walk into dangerous areas at night because you think that's a less safe choice. Maybe you walk on the sidewalks. So you're going along in your life, when something happens to make you believe risk went up, what do? You do something to drive risk back down, right? That's just natural human nature, right? If you're walking down the street and all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of cars moving really fast, maybe you just step a little over so you're not right next to the curb, you're just a little bit further away. And that's very normal. We do this all the time. Now in the US, many years ago, right before I was learning to drive, we debated having a national seatbelt law requiring that all people wear seatbelts. Sam Peltzman was an economist at the University of Chicago at the time, one of the leading thinkers in behavioral economics. And Sam said, look, if you make people wear seatbelts, they will drive faster. Because what is the purpose of a seatbelt? To let you drive faster. It's the same purpose that brakes have, to let you drive faster. If I took the brakes off your car, you would just drive slowly. That's basically what cars used to do. Safety equipment's purpose is to let you achieve more at the same risk tolerance. So if I make you wear a seatbelt, you will drive more dangerously because you think you're going to survive. In fact, fortunately in the US, we have this sport called NASCAR. We don't have to argue about football. Instead, we have car racing. NASCAR is not quite like F1. It's a very different style of vehicle. And they just drive in loops for very long periods of time. But it's basically the same cars, the same tracks, same environmental conditions, and we do it every year. It's a perfect laboratory. As safety equipment gets better, these drivers drive more dangerously because they're not at risk of dying anymore. Sure, they might get into a 20-car pileup, but they're willing to take that risk to win, whereas maybe dying, not so much. And so Sam Peltzman said, look, they're going to drive more dangerously, and in fact, if you look at traffic fatalities in the United States over the last 50 years, he's right. Fatalities for drivers has dropped precipitously per mile driven. For passengers has dropped a little bit, but for pedestrians and motorcyclists, it has gone up. Because the drivers are totally willing to drive in a way that puts other people at risk. So Sam said, look, if we want to make people actually drive safely, reduce overall fatalities, one safety system will do it. I'm kind of glad people didn't listen to Sam. He's a really smart human being about costs, not so much about user benefit. But how do we change risk awareness? This is really important, because if it all comes down to what risk we're aware of, we need to think about how risk moves. So if we just think about this axis as being actual risk, as if we could actually measure actual risk, versus perceived risk, the aggregate humans think they have, and we hope that we're hanging out on the normal point here, somewhere in the middle. Sometimes our risk goes up and we're just ignorant of it, right? We have threat ignorance. Other times our risk goes up in a way that we understand, right? So there's sort of a known vulnerability. Sometimes it doesn't really go up, but we think it does. We call this FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Anybody who's ever had to sit through a vendor security presentation, this is slide number 3, is the one in which they're basically trying to tell you how scary the world is by giving you headlines of breaches at companies that look nothing like yours, that would be solved by a technology that looks nothing like the vendors. So those are the ways it can go. It can change sort of in a negative way, or up. It can also come down. You can have stealth improvements. This I love, when somebody knows that there's something I want them to fix, but they have been not doing it for years, that they're embarrassed about the day that they finally go do it, so they never tell me. And I'm like, my job is to sort of be the risk awareness of the whole company, and you fixed this 6 years ago. I went and fixed like 12 other things to cope with your risk. I'm now glad I did, but it would have been helpful if we'd moved our risk in the right direction. Sometimes we get better and we know it. Other times we do things that we think improve security, but they don't. So we call it security theater. In the US, this is the Transportation Security Agency that doesn't do a whole lot at our airports except spend money. Now you'll notice I left off an axis here. Can we actually move these in dangerous directions, where we get safer but think the opposite, or vice versa? And so I would argue, coming back to that password rotation problem, that in fact, very often we blindly comply with rules that we think make us safer. You rotate your password every 90 days. Doesn't actually make you safer, but you think it does. It makes you safer. But now it causes you to reuse passwords. Use passwords that are easy for adversaries to guess, because you just, I'll add a 1, I'll add a 2, I'll add a 3. So you're doing these things that make you less safe. My favorite example, which is actually from a hotel in England, but I could have been in the hotel I'm in today. It said, for your comfort and safety, great legalese, please ensure, before showering, please ensure the bath mat is securely in place and the shower curtain is inside the bath. Now, you can all tell yourself the story about how this got there, right? Somebody slipped and fell in this bath at some point, and they sued the hotel chain. And so the hotel chain's lawyer said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a sign that says, it's your fault if you slip, and here's what the sign will be, right? So everybody has this mental model. So they think they're safer now because they've reduced their legal liability. Do you know what wasn't in that bathroom? A bath mat or a shower curtain? So now they have gone from a place where you could have argued, look, bathrooms are inherently unsafe, it's on the user, to them saying, oh, we know how unsafe bathrooms are, especially this one, and here's the safety systems you need to use, and we're not going to give them to you. So when I slip and fall, whose fault is it? It's theirs. From a legal liability perspective, they have gotten worse. Their risk went up, they thought it went down. Now, I told this anecdote for a couple of years, and then somebody pointed out to me, they said, yeah, but I bet while you were in that shower, it was the safest shower you had ever taken. And boy, were they right. I had my arm on the wall the whole time. Do you know how hard it is to actually bathe without ever letting go of something? But the shower wasn't actually any more unsafe than anywhere else I'd been. But I was now so focused and aware of this risk that I took action to be safer and still felt unsafe. In one sense, this is really helpful for motivating tactical action. In another sense, this can be very dangerous because it really creates a mismatch with your perceptions of the world. So challenges for risks is when there are those obscure costs or complex returns. We'll keep that in mind for a little later. Now let's think a little bit about the attention spotlight. So when we observe the world, it's all about what we see. Now this is an interesting and fascinating thing. The world is this really complicated place. You have 11 million bits of sensory input arriving into your brain every second, or actually arrive into your body, to be very clear. How many of those can you process? Turns out a Finnish researcher answered that for us. It's about 40. We have to attenuate almost 1 million-fold all of the things clamoring for our attention. So all of these things are coming into this rules engine, some of which is biological, right? We've evolved things to actually filter out before it gets to the brain, and some of it is neurological. It's what's happening inside the brain. We're going to filter these things out. Now, some of these are the biological. This is a fascinating one. Before I said this question, how many of you were cognizant of the feel of the chair or bench underneath your butt? Right, just a couple of people. Right. In any group with computers, you get a higher percentage of folks because that tends to correlate with sensory processing disorder. Doesn't mean you have it. I'm not diagnosing anybody in the room. I have it too, just to be clear. But it's fascinating. But now, how many people are aware of the feel of the chair under their butt? Just made you think about it, and now it's there, and you're like, God, why that? You know, why couldn't it have been something better? So we're filtering out to get down to only a narrow thing at a time, because that's all our brains can handle. And there's a lot of different ways that we're going to filter it down. And in fact, these filtrations all follow a model that's actually pretty simple to understand. And so the first thing that we do is that we ignore things that we expect to see. And that sounds really strange, right? But when you're walking down the road or driving, you actually ignore most of the cars. As long as the car is driving in the right direction, or the cyclist, or the pedestrian, you pattern match on them, they fit your model of the world, you ignore them. Your brain never consciously processes the existence of that. Now, if one of those pedestrians is running sideways at the street, boom, you're going to turn over and look at them, and now you're going to pay attention because they're doing something unexpected. All right, so we want to ignore the things that we expect. And sometimes that can be really dangerous because it means that our memory of what happened is woefully wrong. Because we have a memory of the world that doesn't include those things, but we'd say, no, I would never not see that. You know, also, for things that happened recently, we're going to preference them. And now, why would we do this? You know, and so here's a great example, which is imagine that you are part of a small tribe living in Africa. You know, you've got 150 people, and today one of the children was eaten by a crocodile. That gets your attention, right? Got to do something about this crocodile problem. Now, what if instead you're sitting there and, you know, one of the tribal elders comes over and says, you know, when I was a kid, we had a jaguar problem. Going to spend a lot of attention on how to solve the jaguar problem? No. Very natural for the things that recently happened to gain more of your attention. Right? And that's going to cause us to focus on those things that represent sudden changes in the world. Again, the things that we can act on. And of course, coming back to that tribe, we care about our tribe. If something happens to somebody in your family, are you going to pay more attention to that risk than you're going to necessarily pay to something that happens on the other side of the world? Absolutely. It doesn't make you a bad person. I'm not going to embarrass anybody who says, oh no, I absolutely do. I totally do. Like, risks that you pose to my children matter more to me than risks to somebody on the other side of the planet. And that's reasonable and appropriate. Now, there's some problems with that we'll come back to in a moment. So that's the things that are far away from us. Now, here's the fun thing. How many of you do programming on systems that are in your own data center? Yep, that's part of your tribe. How many of you do things in the cloud? That's not part of your tribe. You worry more about risks in the systems under your control than in the ones that are far away. That's just natural. Like, you have to actively work to say, hey, wait, I'm going over to the cloud. Sure, it's Amazon. They're doing 20 things better than me. But am I into availability zones? Did I think about that? Whereas when you're in your own data center, you're very clear. I'm in one data center. Boy, that's a problem. But how many companies do we see replicate the same problem in AWS that they had legacy but didn't think about it because it's a faraway risk? It's not something that jumps out at them. And of course, things that surprise us are going to get our attention. Right? That all comes back to sort of this theme of sudden changes near us in time and space and tribe are the things that we're going to pay attention to at this moment because they represent hazards. Right? If you're that tribes person and you're sitting around your fire pit and all of a sudden the grass is moving not with the wind. Right? It's happening near you, it just started happening, and boy, is that surprising. It's probably a predator sneaking up on your campfire. Maybe you should do something about it. And even if you're wrong, you're better off acting at this moment than not acting in general. You become that jellyfish. So these are all the ways that we're going to sort of winnow down all of this input to prioritize what we should think about making different choices on and how we do risk management. Now, the challenge here is distributed social networks. How many people are on Facebook? Okay, Dunbar's number says you have about 150 people that you can maintain mental focus on being your tribe. How many of you have far more than 150 friends on Facebook? And if something bad happens to them, it's like something happened in your tribe? Right? Facebook and other social media have created this ability for you to sort of put this placeholder on somebody. Somebody who's not really your friend or your tribesmate in that old world. Maybe you went to high school with them. Maybe it's your, gardens, cousins, wife. But they put stuff here. You see it all the time. You don't have to invest any energy in it. So the number of people that we will react to information on has gone up. Instead of 150 people triggering this on us, now it might be several thousand people. Fast information flow means we learn about every tragedy in the world in real time. So we trigger that novelty and recency when we're making choices. You hear about things the same while they're happening rather than a day later in the press. Now for acting, it's all about trained responses. And here's where we're going to get to another moment of audience participation. So I have a line in the middle of the screen. I'm going to put words up on the left side of the line or on the right side of the line. And I need you to say the word left or right. So if it shows up on this side, you say left. Shows up on this side, you say right. To make this really easy, we'll walk you through it to begin. I always love the laugh I get there. Congratulations, you're all in the Army now. What's fascinating about that one is how tentative everybody is. Nobody wants to be the first one to speak on the first one. And then you sort of figure out what the cadence is. I'm going to make it a little bit trickier. They're not just going to alternate here. What just happened there? Come on, this is an easy one. So here's what happened. We have two systems in our brain, behavioral economic system. Think about them as system 1 and system 2. Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow. Why we should not let economists name anything. System 1 and system 2. Fast lizard brain, slow monkey brain. Right? Your whole job as a life form is to not do anything in the slow monkey brain because it consumes a heck of a lot of calories. Thinking is hard. We don't want to do it. That sounds really odd that that's our goal in life. So you're always trying to find ways to do things in system 1, the fast lizard brain. Turns out system 1 can read, but it cannot distinguish left and right very easily. So we trained system 1 on the first one, just read the words. Screw this whole big instruction, we'll just read the words. We get to the second one, and all of a sudden, it's just trying to read the words. And for some of you, it got those words out before the slow monkey brain noticed and said, hey, what's going on? For some of you, you jumped in early. And then you were slower the whole way through, because now the slow monkey brain is actively engaged in burning cognition to get to the right answers. And that's not sustainable, but it's very important for us to understand that we will always try to jump to trained responses. They're not always the right trained responses. You could pivot from this into an hour rant about machine learning and AI. I will leave that as an exercise for the rest of you. But it's really important to notice that we repurpose responses from other things. The Dunning-Kruger effect kicks in. For those of you not familiar with this, this is the opposite of the imposter syndrome. It's when you totally think you are qualified to do something and you're not. So these are the things that are going to kick in here. So to synthesize from those first two initial hypotheses, humans are terrible at risk management, humans are awesome. In the right situation, humans are awesome at risk management. Right? When the world fits our models or is close enough to it, where we have the capacity to act in ways that we understand, this is where humanity is fantastic. Unfortunately, I think that we're in the end of that right situation. Potentially we're in a place where our mental models aren't appropriate. The world has become too complicated, hence the impending complexity apocalypse, where we're trying to react to too many inputs because they all really seem to matter to us. That, because we have so much input, we are dropping out information that would inform wiser choices and only paying attention to the things that confirm what we want to go do, and that we all think we're more competent at anything than we really are. Now that's actually a good place to be. That last one, everybody should suffer Dunning-Kruger syndrome. Because if you don't, you're stuck in imposter syndrome. You get one or the other. You can have both, but you can't get to neither one of them. Right? So you should feel like you can do more than you really can, and ideally at the same time, you should feel like you're not quite good enough so that you're always trying to learn more. So don't walk away thinking that you should aim for your sweet spot. You should always try to improve that one. But how do we get better? Because it's not good enough for me just to come up here and say, the world's gonna end, ha ha, enjoy. Although I have to say, as an apocalyptic futurist, there's this really great point, which is either I am right, in which case I get to be the last person on Earth going, woohoo, I was right, or I'm wrong, in which case the world gets to keep going. These are two good outcomes from my perspective. But let's see if we can improve the world, a better outcome. So first of all, we have to understand that we can adversarially train ourselves. But if we want to do that, we should think about how adversaries use the OODA loop to compete with each other. So in competition, every time you see an OODA loop, your action is an observation for your opponent, changes their actions. And so we can train ourselves by looking at our own actions, observing them and changing. We should understand how OODA skills get broken. So we talked about how, the attention spotlight, but really blindness and distraction, not finding the right evidence, is how you break the observation cycle. For the orientation cycle, you try to induce confusion or complacency in your enemy. We see this all the time in the DDoS world. Adversaries who will do fake attacks to distract you from the right place so that you're not looking at the right thing. Or they do an attack that's really small and you're like, oh yeah, I can totally handle. Whoa, what was that? Right? So really trying to sort of slow you down. On the decisioning side, adversaries really love to give you analysis paralysis. How can I keep you from making a decision by giving you insufficient information? Or how can I get you to make the wrong choice even better? And of course, when you want to break somebody's action, it's all about causing their movements to be inept, make them not really affect the world. My favorite story here was a customer of ours who had a bot problem on one of their websites. And they had a 45-minute OODA loop, basically, from when a new bot network would show up and a bot started attacking them. In 45 minutes, they could shut down the bot. That sounds like a fantastically fast turnaround time. That's really great for human loops. One day, one of their systems failed. It took them an hour and a half to mitigate. And when they went back through their logs, they noticed that the adversary, every bot showed up for 46 minutes. The adversary had timed their 45 minutes already. They had just built it into their system. Their entire set of actions was inept. They had done all of this work, and the adversary basically neutralized it by saying, oh, you've blocked me, I'm already not attacking you anymore anyway. Ways in which the adversaries do this, right? You act with stealth. You generate false alerts. Right? You input things into that attention scheme to mess with it. From an orientation, it's always about misdirection. How do I get you to look at something different than the thing that's going to cause you to act? From a decisioning, it's about causing you to misprioritize, make you think something is worse than it is or less bad than it is. Right? If you know that you're facing an existential threat, then you know you have to act. So if I can convince you it's not existential, maybe you don't act for a little while. And then the last adversary skill is really about maneuvering. It's right, moving faster than your opponent does, in this case, the defender. So we can learn from these skills, right? If adversaries can use them to target us, we can use them to target ourselves as well. And so when you think about this, right, so adversaries often try to act below our detection thresholds. Well, maybe we can do that to ourselves. Maybe we can say, hey, how do I narrow down the amount of information that I'm looking at in real time so that I can think about what's valuable? It's a place where threat intelligence is highly valuable. You don't want to look at every attack coming your way. Can you get somebody else to filter through that and bring to you only the things that matter and delay it so that you're not panicking? Adversaries like to, attacks to change up your model. So if you think you're making bad decisions, how do you attack your own model? How do you understand how the choices that you're making are informed by your wrong understanding of the world? And can you do the same thing to yourself that an adversary would do? On changing your prioritization, it's sometimes about splitting up impacts. Maybe you bring them back together. Maybe you build a model of the world that says, hey, if I do this change, it'll improve 20 things, and so I should prioritize that over any one change to improve any of those 20 things. And in action, our adversaries, think about creating planned evasions, red herrings. I don't say herrings just because I have the penguin here, although he's always happy when I do that. And acting with faster OODA loops, right? Get inside your own cycle. And so you think about this as that your OODA loop is not one thing, right? There's not like one main processor in your brain that's running the OODA loop cycle and making these call-outs. You have things that run very fast and things that run slow. So take advantage of that. Treat your actions as an input to a slower moving OODA circle. Anybody who's done optimizations of processes is very familiar with this, right? This is basically what you do. You run the process a lot and you sit back and you watch it. You say, how do I change that process? Well, in this case, the process that you're changing is yourself. Observe it, orient, understand how its models might not match the models you want, decide what you want to do, and act to change its models. Right? Sometimes this gets called tactics and strategy, both in business and in warfighting. You don't have to use those words. That's a way to mentally think about this. That we can get better at how we make risk choices, but it involves us very consciously trying to do so and understanding the forces that are driving us to make poor choices. And so that's sort of the improvement model. So if you want to improve your observation, better instrumentation of the world, make sure you understand what's really going wrong. Reducing the noise of things that don't really matter to you. For orientation, analyze your models. Are they accurate? Are they helpful? If not, change them. Doing hazard reviews, actually looking at the things that you worry about and understanding what the underlying hazards really are. Many times, the things that most worry us, if we were asked off the top of the head, what worries you, aren't the things you should be worried about. They're just a recent thing. So analyze those. Decide if those are really accurate. From a decisioning perspective, it's often all about planning. Walk through a decision before you do it the first time. Take that step. How many people here do incident response planning at all? Okay, just a handful of people. So it might not, I'm in the middle of doing our planning, and what we always practice? Press notification. If I have to disclose something to the press, I have to plan how to do that. Because the day that I actually need to do it is not when I want to be trying to decide if I'm going to do it, because I won't even know what it means. I'll be afraid of it. So same thing with any decision step you might take there. For decisioning also, Bayesian retrospection, which for those of you who've not done Bayesian, it's check your priors. Right? You had a bunch of assumptions about how the world was going to change based on what you did. After you do it, go check and see if that really came true. I often challenge my organization with this. I say, if you didn't do that work, how would the world be different? How many people have done been a third party or done the third party review where the security team sends you this checklist of, do you do these 200 things? Right? Do they do anything with it on the back end? The real answer is most people don't. Right? Some people do. But if you stopped doing that, would it change the business outcomes? And if the answer is no, why are you doing it? Right? Don't waste your energy on things that aren't improving your world. And from acting, it's all about training. How do you want to change the way you interact with the world? And practice that. I have a silly example for this one. I was driving to my kid's school, and it's in an industrial complex, very similar to this one, actually. And I drive a Ford Mustang, so I'm sort of the opposite of Frank there, that I have the very big petrol guzzler. And I was driving a little faster than I probably should have near someone's loading zone. And so they yelled at me as I'm going past. They went, slow down! Right, and I drive past. And I walk over a week later to that loading zone, and I walk in, and I am terrified. Like, I have to go confront people. And I walk in and I say, hey, who was it that said slow down to that guy in the Mustang? Because that was me, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been doing it. I went and apologized. Right? I practiced that. Before I could walk in, I'd go say, what are the 6 elements of an apology? What am I going to say? Right? But now I've practiced it. And that's an important thing to understand, that if you want to be able to take an action and you haven't planned and practiced and trained it how to do it, not only are you unlikely to do it, but you will do it badly. The next time you see an apology in the press, usually from a politician, read how much it doesn't feel like an apology. Right? I'm sorry that you were offended. No, you're not. You're sorry I called you on it. You're sad, but you're not sorry. I am sorry I took an action. Here's why I took the action. I shouldn't have done it. Here's how I will get better. That's an apology. If you don't practice it, you'll do it wrong. And finally, in the action phase, it's all about understanding the impacts. Did you have the impact on the world you wanted to have with that action, or did it go badly? In that case, I wasn't just apologizing to them. I was modeling to the kids who'd been in the car with me, here's how you apologize for something. Here's how you diffuse a situation so that every time I drive by, I'm not worried they're going to yell at me. Right? I went and apologized. The kids understood that. So that's how you improve the world. Some guideposts for you. And so with that, I think I nominally have about 5 more minutes, but we'll see what Frank really thinks there for questions if there are any. Anyone? Are people really excited to get to the cocktails? Because I would totally understand that, and I'm going to be there too. So questions there are also possible, but fewer people will hear the answer if you do that. So.
One of the well-known models of acting on things is the trolley experiment.
Yep.
Considering, like, are you going to kill one person or 5 persons? In your opinion, not acting, is it as bad as just choosing which one dies?
Yep. So you've put me in the context of the trolley experiment, and I put trolley experiment psychologists 1 step below time travelers on the list of people you should kill immediately for doing immoral actions like tying people to the trolley. From the trolley perspective, right, I think it's an artificial problem. And that's why it's really important for you to step back. I actually like the problem, because you should say, look, if the choice is kill 5 or kill 1, and you're saying I only have one thing I can do, I call BS on that. What are the things I could do to save more people, right? Now, fundamentally, from an ethical perspective, if you force me down into the constraint, taking the action is the problem, right? If you take an action to kill a human being, right, I can't value 1 versus 5. Now, I can value if it's like that 1 is trying to kill the 5, totally I can take the action at that point, but that's not the constraint of the trolley problem. But functionally, like, it's reasonable to look at that and to talk through it, but your answer should be, why do you have a trolley design with people strapped to the rails? That seems like a poor choice in designing. I need to understand your motives as a researcher for why you thought this was a good choice, because it's totally incomprehensible to me. But maybe you can inform me, right? And so there's a great way to engage on that conversation and duck the question at the same time.
More questions to duck.
So how do you embed these learnings into your organization? You have different teams, many do nothing with security at all. How do you make this understandable to them?
So the goal here is not to make everybody understand all of this information at once. It's for my team to understand this so they can better engage with our partners. So when an engineer comes and says, look, I'm doing this thing, and your first reaction is, God, that's a stupid thing. To never say those words, never reveal that, right? Because what you say is, I don't understand why we're doing that. Can you explain to me the business rationale? What are we trying to accomplish? Because sometimes right there, you just change the whole model, right? Now I understand why you're doing it. Maybe it's still a dumb thing after you explain it. So I say, okay, what are the unacceptable losses that could happen? Because what I think your model's wrong, right? That's the mental model I've got. I need to change your model. Like, I could tell you not to do it, but then your mental model of all the security person wants to do is say no is justified, and you're going to do whatever you can to survive this conversation and go do what you're going to do anyway. So I have to recognize that that's the outcome of the action I would normally take. They're just saying, hey, bad idea, don't do it. So I say, okay, so you want to do this thing. You want to go to this tweakers event at night. What are you expecting to get out of it? What are your unacceptable losses? What could go wrong? Like, could you be put on the spot by the speaker with a challenging answer because you asked a rough question? And are you okay with that? And if you're like, I'm totally okay with that. I'm like, oh, I'm afraid of people, so I wouldn't be okay with that. But if you're cool with that, great, let's go ahead and do that. How can we make sure you have the best possible question? Oh, let's ask a question about tying it back to the business. Would that be great for you? And that's what you just did, right? So you went through that process in your head. Like, you may not have actively thought about it, but that's how humans operate. So this is all about getting security people to really understand one really important truth. We don't make money for our businesses. We are not value drivers. And I say that as somebody who took security in a non-security business and turned us into a security business. Now somebody else runs that. That's a product. The core security of our platform is not a value driver, not in the eyes of the people who write products. I think it is. I don't think Akamai exists as the cloud player it is today if we did not have that amazing security. But every single day, I have to interact with people who rightly, within their tactical view, are correct, that they're the one who is paying my paycheck. Right? And so I can only affect the world by affecting them, not their choices. Because as soon as they walk away, they'll perform for me, oh, of course I do great security, and then they walk out the door and do something different. I've got to make them really care and believe. And I can only do that by understanding where they come from. And so look, I'll be really honest. I think every human being should understand this and live this way because it would make us all much kinder humans. But if all I can do is get my security team to be kinder humans, we get more done. That's why George is over there. So George is the penguin. If you were like, what the heck is this guy doing with a stuffed penguin? George wanders around the world and visits Akamai staff who've done great things for security and hangs out with them. They get their picture with George. Do you know how many people value that human contact, penguin contact? A lot. People say, wow, you really care about me. You value the work that I did enough that you'll send me this stuffed flightless bird to take a picture with. It's amazing how much that little contact matters. And so it's looking for things like that will change human behaviors. We're not trying to change human nature. We just want to align our goals, the business goals, with this other person's belief of the business goals. They're all business goals. We just have different pieces that we see. We're just trying to line them up. Is that my hook or?
Okay. Well, I think then I won't take the risk of the audience getting mad at me, and I'll say it's time for cocktails. Thank you, Andy. Your risk modeling said that you wanted a gift that makes sure that somebody else will accommodate you. So one of our team went into Amsterdam and bought you a little something to give away.
Thank you.
And with that, I think the bar's that way, right?
Okay.
Nobody wants to be the first one to get up because it's socially awkward. So stand up if you're at that end, because you're going to be blocking the people behind you.